It was a battle that should never have happened, fought weeks after peace had been declared, its outcome known too late to matter by the diplomats in Europe. And yet, on a fog-laced morning in Louisiana, thousands of British soldiers were led into the jaws of a waiting enemy, commanded by a man who had no formal military training, but would one day become President of the United States. His men were not polished professionals. They were fishermen and freed slaves, pirates and merchants, frontiersmen and farmers Americans, armed not just with muskets, but with a cause. Why did the British press forward into certain doom? Why did General Edward Pakenham, heir to one of the greatest military legacies of the British Empire, march into a muddy canal flanked by swamp and cannon fire, when the ink of peace was already dry? And why has the Battle of New Orleans, one of the most lopsided and violent victories in American military history, remained such a paradox fought after the war was over, and yet changing the course of the young nation's destiny? This is the story of the final, brutal clash of the War of 1812. A story of miscommunication, overconfidence, desperate heroism, and the improbable victory of a cobbled-together army of American misfits against the might of an imperial force that had just defeated Napoleon in the shattered smoke of dawn. On the 8th of January, 1815, history held its breath. What followed was slaughter. By the winter of 1814, the War of 1812 was dragging into its third year, born from a toxic brew of maritime disputes, impressment of American sailors, and the lingering tensions of American independence. The war had ground into stalemate. British forces were tied down in the Napoleonic Wars until the spring of 1814, and once Napoleon was exiled to Elba, they turned their full attention to their former colonies. In the American South, the British set their sights on something decisive. The port city of New Orleans. Controlling it would sever the United States from its interior, cutting off the Mississippi River, stifling trade, and bringing American westward expansion to a painful halt in a war filled with indecisive skirmishes. Capturing New Orleans promised a symbolic and strategic victory, but the timing was cruel. On the 24th of December, 1814, in the Belgian city of Ghent, British and American diplomats signed a treaty formally ending the war. It would take weeks for this news to travel across the Atlantic. While peace was already secured on paper, men were still dying on the battlefield, none more brutally than what would unfold just outside New Orleans. In the days leading up to the British assault, an enormous naval fleet assembled in the Gulf. 60 ships under Admiral Alexander Cochrane carried 14,000 British troops, including hardened veterans from the Peninsular Wars in Spain. Among them were Scottish Highlanders, Royal Marines, and West Indian regiments. Their commander, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, a decorated hero and the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington. Their landing point was the plantation of Jacques Villeray, just south of New Orleans. On the 23rd of December, 1814, British troops made their way through narrow bayous and swamps, emerging onto Villeray's land. But their presence was discovered quickly. Villeray escaped and alerted Andrew Jackson, the fiery general and commander of the Southern U.S. forces. Jackson wasted no time. That very evening, just as the British were settling in and preparing meals over open fires, the Americans struck with startling aggression. Jackson led over 2,000 men in a surprise nighttime assault that sowed confusion and inflicted heavy casualties. Gunpowder smoke clouded the swampy air, and the fighting devolved into hand-to-hand savagery. The British reeled. The Americans then withdrew to a more defensible position. The Rodriguez Canal? It was here, just 5 miles southeast of New Orleans. that Jackson ordered the construction of earthworks' massive defensive lines of mud, timber, and cotton bales. Over the next 2 weeks, the Americans transformed this stretch of soggy land into a fortress. Jackson, ever the populist, had assembled a ragtag coalition to defend the city. His army included Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen, free black militiamen, Choctaw warriors, French Creole volunteers, and even Jean Lafitte's pirates offered amnesty. In exchange for artillery expertise, the entire city was under martial law, and every able-bodied man was enlisted. Jackson's genius was not in classical strategy, but in turning New Orleans into a people's fortress. By the 25th of December, Pakenham arrived to take command. He was appalled. The Americans were not breaking. They were entrenching. The canal was now a muddy moat, lined with redoubts, cannon, and sharpshooters. Worse still, Jackson had in place artillery on the opposite side of the Mississippi River, allowing him to flank any British advance with lethal crossfire. Pakenham conferred with his generals. The plan they devised was complex but bold. While Major General Samuel Gibbs would lead the main frontal assault on the Rodriguez Canal, a separate force under Colonel William Thornton would cross the river and capture the American battery on the west bank, turning it against Jackson. On the 7th of January, after days of preparation, the British were ready. It would be the last night many of them would see. Midnight, the 8th of January, the British troops began to move under the cloak of dense Louisiana fog. Somewhere out in the thick, onzine mist, the men of Colonel Thornton's detachment prepared their boats to cross the Mississippi. This crossing was the linchpin of Pakenham's entire plan. If Thornton could disable the American artillery across the river, then Gibbs' frontal assault might stand a chance. If not, those guns would rip the redcoats to shreds as they advanced. But fate, as so often in war, had its own plans. The dam built to ferry the crossing boats into the Mississippi collapsed, a small disaster with devastating consequences. Thornton's force was suddenly bottlenecked. Only 450 of the intended 1,500 men could make it across before sunrise. Those who did were exhausted and disoriented, having landed nearly a full mile off course, thanks to the powerful current of the Mississippi. Worse still, they were now far behind schedule and had no way of signaling their delay. On the eastern bank, time was slipping. Pakenham waited, then waited longer, but the fog was both ally and enemy. It concealed the movement of his troops, but also obscured communication. With no signal from Thornton, and the sun threatening to rise, Pakenham faced a brutal choice: delay and lose the advantage of fog, or press the attack and risk marching straight into the teeth of Jackson's cannons. He chose to attack. In the thick morning air, drums echoed through the swamp. The red lines of British infantry began their steady march toward the Rodriguez Canal. Men of the 44th Regiment led the charge, except they had forgotten the ladders. Ladders, the one item that would allow British troops to scale the canal and breach the American ramparts. It was an unthinkable oversight. Pakenham and General Gibbs exploded in fury. The men were ordered to retrieve the ladders, but it was too late. The assault had begun. Time and fog were running out. Behind the American defenses, Jackson was listening, not listening. The heavy drums told him the British were advancing, and though he couldn't see them yet, he could hear the rhythm of battle drawing closer. His command to his men was simple and unshakable. Hold, wait for my order. Keep your heads low. Don't fire until I give the word. Behind Jackson stood a patchwork force: frontiersmen with long rifles, pirate manning cannon, black militiamen wielding bayonets, native scouts ready with tomahawks. They waited in absolute silence, the air dense with moisture and tension. And then, in one sickening gust, the fog peeled back, the battlefield opened like a curtain at a theater, revealing thousands of red-coated British soldiers marching in formation across the open fields of the Chalmette Plantation. It was as if God himself had cleared the stage. Jackson gave the signal. The American line erupted. Cannons unleashed canister and grape shot, turning men into clouds of red mist. Rifles cracked. Sharpshooters picked off officers. The 44th, without their ladders, found themselves trapped sitting ducks between a canal and a wall of fire. Still, a few units pressed forward. Keen's 93er Highlanders, resplendent in their tartan, attempted to support Gibbs's faltering line, but even they began to fall mowed down by precise volleys from Jackson's entrenched men. On the far side of the canal, confusion turned into panic. General Gibbs, frustrated and exposed, rode to the front to rally his men. He was shot through the head and chest and collapsed instantly. Moments later, Keene, now leading his own regiment, was hit in the groin by a musket ball and dragged off the field, bleeding heavily. Pakenham saw the slaughter unfolding. He galloped to the front, determined to reorganize what remained, but fate struck again. A shell exploded near his horse. He was struck in the knee, then the spine. Paralyzed and bleeding out, he gave one final command. Tell Lambert, bring up the reserves. But Lambert never would. On the western bank of the Mississippi, Colonel Thornton had at last reached the American battery. Though outnumbered nearly 3-1, his exhausted troops mounted a ferocious bayonet charge, overwhelming the defenders and capturing the position. It was too late. The eastern assault had already collapsed. By the time the American guns on the west bank fell silent, the British command structure lay in ruins. Pakenham was dead. Gibbs was dead. Keene was wounded. Of the entire British frontline force, nearly half were casualties. Thornton's success meant nothing now. General Lambert, standing amidst the wounded remnants of his army, refused to commit the reserves with Admiral Cochrane. He retreated to a nearby plantation house and made the decision to call off the attack. By noon, the battlefield had quieted. The Americans, shocked by the scale of their own success, watched as the British withdrew in silence. The cost? 800 vanquished, British soldier killed, over 2,400 wounded, and of those wounded, nearly half would have their limbs amputated in field surgeries without anesthesia. The Americans, just 8 killed, 14 wounded, a ratio so staggering that it has rarely been repeated in modern warfare. The silence that followed the British retreat was thick with disbelief. For Andrew Jackson and his men, the scene was almost surreal. Bodies lined the field. Smoke still hung in the humid morning air. Blood mingled with swamp water in the Rodriguez Canal. But more shocking than the carnage was the sheer scale of American success. Jackson's force had stood their ground in, unlikely coalition of every class and culture. The young republic could muster and shattered one of the most powerful armies on earth. Yet, what makes the Battle of New Orleans so striking in retrospect is not merely its lopsided death toll. It is that the battle was completely and utterly unnecessary. 2 weeks earlier, in a Kiat room in Ghent, Belgium, a treaty had been signed that would end the war of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent restored pre-war boundaries and called for peace between Britain and the United States. But in the age before telegraph cables and steamships, peace could only travel as fast as wind and sail. News of the treaty would not reach New Orleans until mid-February. This delay sealed the fate of over 3,000 men. But what did this final post-war battle actually achieve? Strangely, everything. Though fought after the war's end, the Battle of New Orleans shaped its legacy more than any formal agreement could. In the United States, it was seen not as a meaningless bloodletting, but as a defining momentous last stand where democracy had crushed monarchy, where citizens had humbled empire. Jackson became an overnight legend. His image spread like wildfire across newspapers and ballads. Here was a man who had defied every rule of military orthodoxy, held the line with volunteers and outlaws, and delivered a humiliating blow to the British Empire. In a nation desperate for heroes, Jackson became a mythic figure. By 1829, he would ride this reputation into the White House as the 7th President of the United States. But this legacy came at a cost. Jackson's experience during the battle shaped the rest of his life, particularly his distrust of centralized power and his belief in populist force. His decision to declare martial law in New Orleans 7, jailing a federal judge who tried to challenge him, foreshadowed the authoritarian streak that would define his presidency. His brutal campaigns against Native American tribes in the decades that followed also echoed the uncompromising tactics he used in Louisiana. For Britain, the battle was a national embarrassment. Coming so soon after their triumph over Napoleon, British leaders had expected a relatively quick and clean operation. Instead, they walked away bloodied and humiliated. Though the Treaty of Ghent meant the war officially ended in a draw, New Orleans left a psychological scar. It served as a grim reminder that American resolve, when channeled with purpose, could pose a real threat to even the most seasoned European powers. It also changed how Britain viewed American territory. After New Orleans, the idea of reconquering parts of the United States or redrawing borders through military force became politically and militarily untenable. This subtle shift in thinking contributed to a century of uneasy but mostly peaceful relations between the two nations. For the American people, New Orleans marked a turning point in national identity. The War of 1812 had begun in confusion and division, with New England states even threatening secession. But it ended with a moment of clarity. The Second War of Independence, as some called it, had proven that the United States could stand its ground, no longer merely a rebellious colony. It was now a rising power on the global stage. And yet, for all its symbolic weight, the war itself changed almost nothing on paper. The Treaty of Ghent restored all borders to pre-war lines. The causes of the conflict, maritime rights, impressment, trade restrictions, were never fully resolved. But after New Orleans, none of that mattered. The myth had been written in blood and fire and fog. What's more, the battle offered a haunting lesson in the limits of empire and the price of miscalculation. General Pakenham had every reason to believe in his plan. He had the numbers, the experience, the discipline, but he lacked one crucial weapon: time. Time for peace to be known. Time for intelligence to catch up. Time for Thornton's signal to arrive. In war, time is often the most fatal enemy. In the end, the battlefield of Chalmette became hallowed ground not because it ended a war, but because it revealed something deeper: a clash between old world and new, between inherited rank and earned authority, between armies that fought for crown and coinan, men who fought because they had no other choice. Years later, long after the smoke had cleared and the names of the fallen had faded from public memory, veterans of the Battle of New Orleans would speak of the fog, not just the literal fog that blanketed the fields of Chalmette, hiding death and revealing it in a sudden, cruel burst of sunlight, but the metaphorical fog of a war that no longer existed, a battle waged in the void between peace and war, where neither side truly understood what they were fighting for anymore. The British fought for imperial objectives, for strategic control of the Mississippi River, and perhaps deep down for a final attempt to put the rebellious former colonies back in their place. But by 1815, the world had changed. Empires were beginning to learn that gunboats could not conquer ideology. That revolution, once unleashed, was not easily contained by battalions or treaties. The Americans fought, yes, to defend New Orleans, but also for something more ethereal: dignity, recognition, a sense of permanence, to prove, once and for all, that the United States was not an experiment, but a nation, and that a ragtag army of volunteers, immigrants, slaves, and swampland mercenaries could forge the steel of a republic with nothing but grit and a wall of cotton bales. The fog lifted on the 8th of January, but the questions it obscured never fully disappeared. Why did Andrew Jackson press so hard, even as peace neared? Why did the British persist in launching one of the most disorganized attacks in their military history? Could the entire slaughter have been avoided with better communication? Or was it inevitable, destined by pride, distance, and the cruel machinery of war? The fields of Chalmette have long since returned to silence. The Rodriguez Canal is now no more than a shallow indentation in the land. Tourists walk through the battlefield, sometimes unaware of the carnage that once unfolded beneath their feet. And yet, the legacy of that morning lives on. It lives in the myth of American resilience, in the belief that democracy, imperfect though it may be, can overcome the pageantry of aristocratic conquest. It lives in the complex legacy of Andrew Jackson, a hero to some, a tyrant to others. It lives in the warning whispered through history that when power is unchecked and assumptions go unchallenged, even peace itself may arrive too late to save the dying. The Battle of New Orleans was the last major engagement of the War of 1812, but in many ways, it was the first battle of something far greater. A century where the United States would rise not just as a nation, but as an idea, a place where rank would not be inherited, but earned, where empire would be challenged not only by guns, but by belief. And still, there's one last irony. The men who died that day, British and American alike, never knew the war was over. They fought and bled and screamed and fell in the mud, not for a treaty, not for a flag, but because someone had told them it was their duty, because the signal never came, because the ladders were forgotten, because the fog never lifted in time. History, at its core, is not always just about nations or treaties or borders. Sometimes it's about a single morning where the world could have turned one way but chose another. A morning when redcoats marched through mist, a wall of cannon waited, and the course of a young nation was forever changed by a battle that, on paper, should never have happened at all. UAG. This is Legacy Files. If history still echoes for you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the truths time tried to bury.